Hi, Professor Pettigrew.
Yes,
Nice.
I can hear you.
You can hear me fine. Good. Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. How are you?
Pretty good.
Yeah, having a decent day?
Yeah. Sitting at the computer writing, which is what I do.
Oh,
Uh,
I become painfully aware of that as I start to look through even the things that are available to dig through that you've written online. I couldn't possibly catch up and read them all.
it helps during the crisis we're in right now to keep me going.
Yeah.
So, what are you up to?
Well, I gave you a little hint of it in our email, but I'll try to keep my part fairly brief so I can hear your expertise. But I was a couple months ago, and I think it was inspired by the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that my curiosity was piqued further about what's going on in our own community and what can really matter in Syracuse, New York. And by the way, do you mind if I record this conversation? I should ask
No,
you that. Okay.
go right ahead.
And thank you. And in doing that, I was surfing around on the National Archives site to see if there was any historical material that might be interesting, and I came across this map of 1919 Syracuse, New York, which was put together by the city engineer, which had overtly labeled neighborhoods by ethnicity, including Italian, Polish, Irish, German, Jewish, and Negro, in handwritten pencil. And the Negro neighborhood was hatch marked with red lines, and and the other ones were yellow, blue, and green. Which that sparked something in my mind that I had seen before, and started looking into the maps that were drawn in 1934 or so for the HOLC under FDR, and realized that wasn't invented in the 1930s. That system had already been utilized, if not informally, by communities across the country. And again, that got me thinking about those same neighborhoods that were staked out a century ago or 75 years ago continue to be the neighborhoods in our community that have the highest rate of concentrated poverty. And in fact, I did a story with a professor from Rutgers about 5 years ago, and you probably have read what he put out publicly, I'm guessing, but we actually brought him to Syracuse because Syracuse was number one on the list nationally of communities that were suffering from high concentrations of poverty in these neighborhoods. And
Who was that?
this is
What was
Paul
his name?
Paul Jaworski,
No, I don't know him.
right from a he's it was one of the Rutgers campuses in New Jersey. But if you ever Google concentrated poverty, his studies were widely shown, reported in all kinds of media about 4 or 5 years ago. So that got me looking further into Syracuse. And I actually grew up in this community, and I'm 54 years old now. In fact, my father's 89, so I can directly relate to where you are in your life. But my grandparents were around in 1919 and living in those Irish and German neighborhoods. And my family specifically, my parents had the fortune of being a white middle class family, was able to move out to the suburbs based on all these programs that were put into place that helped families like ours just kind of get along and have a decent life, not considering the ones that were being left behind.
Yeah, well,
So
that was all over the United States.
yeah, it was all.
Syracuse really isn't, excuse me, that different.
No, that's what I guess I knew that, but it's these last 6 weeks or so I started to dig into it a little further, and then it relates to so many elements. And as you saw from the clipping that I sent you, that reminded you that you actually did visit here on one of your many stops, that Syracuse's schools continue today really to be segregated, but my concern is that nobody seems particularly concerned.
Yeah, that's true. And even though the Black Lives Matter movement is on, you still don't hear that much discussion of it. For me, the most basic segregation is exactly what you're talking about. That is neighborhoods. neighborhood segregation, housing, and that automatically makes for segregated schools unless you have something like the Metropolitan Park plan that I was pushing for. But now we have more segregation in schools than we had before 1954, which is pretty discouraging. And I'm worried that the Black Lives Movement and all the discussion these days on race, they talk about it like it's an individual phenomenon. That is, individual whites should be guilty because they're prejudiced and so forth, when the basic things are exactly what you're talking about, neighborhood and school segregation, and there's very little discussion going on of that. And I'm worried that it's going to not end up creating structural change.
Well, that phrase, I think, is you've hit right on it. Structural change. That as you know from the 50s and the 60s, and even in the 70s with more demonstrations, that demonstrations do get people's attention, but that's where I'm looking for our reporting to go, say, in the coming months, even, not today, but in the coming months. What can change structurally that will make a difference over the long term, and what do you think? Well, let's go back to Syracuse in the late 60s. We were obviously a northern city, so a different list of issues maybe than the southern cities had, but nevertheless there were overtly segregated schools that they were trying to desegregate, and one of the considerations was this campus plan that you were advocating for, and also an inter-district resolution. Why did you think those things were important, and why do you still think they're important?
Well, I was trying to overcome the housing segregation that structurally determined the school segregation. I was, well, 69, yeah. I was working at that time, too, as a consultant with the Civil Rights Commission, back when we actually had a Civil Rights Commission that cared about racism. We don't anymore. The commission pushed for suburban and central city coordination, and we actually achieved it in a few places. Wilmington, Delaware, though as a Democrat, I'm embarrassed to say Biden did not help us. He was scared to death the suburban vote was going to go against him.
Mm-hmm.
He was with us, and then he shifted on us. And there's some other places where it took place. One was in Louisville, Kentucky, and so forth. So we had a few success cases, and but overall, of course, that was the time of Nixon. The commission was going up against the wall, in part, given the Republican Party's position. For that matter, there were Democrats too who thought we were crazy. I also was consulting with, I told you, with the Senator Mondale,
mm-hmm.
and he actually put up a bill. I can't remember the exact details now. I think it passed partly. It didn't pass in one of it passed in one of the houses and not in the other. And I can't remember which. For federal money for metropolitan parks. So it actually got a shot there at the federal level, but it didn't become law.
It was in our community, as I go back through the newspaper clippings to kind of get the blow by blow. There was a measure passed in the Syracuse School District to go to this campus model, although it was still going to be within the city limits, but on the periphery, on the edges of the city, as opposed to, neighborhood schools. But clearly that was like 68, 69, and then as you're mentioning, the political will changed. Nixon appointing people to the Supreme Court certainly altered the direction. I was recently listening to the Milliken versus Bradley oral arguments from the 74, I think it is, and where the now tilting conservative court says Detroit does not need to have a external of the city resolution to their segregation problem, that they need to remain within the city boundaries. And
oh yeah, that was a killing decision. At the same time, they overturned the decision that we won. I say we because it's my hometown, Richmond, Virginia,
mm-hmm.
and we won in the district level. But in our case, we had a metropolitan plan that cut it up into combined the counties around Richmond into 7 districts, and we actually showed we could reduce busing, which took away the basic argument,
mm-hmm.
and the court still turned it down at the appellate level. We won at the local level. I was a witness in the case. I was involved in a case in Norfolk, Virginia, and again we won at the district level and lost. By that time, the Republican appointments were affecting the district level courts.
Yeah, and so
the worst cases, by my odds, are the ones that involve Louisville and Seattle. You mentioned the Seattle case, where they had some minimal busing, not anything extravagant, and the Supreme Court turned them down both on the grounds that it was discrimination against whites, which was a new twist, and they had to end those programs, which had been in fact quite successful.
Why do you think that the country then, despite the force of the courts, from 1954 and the Brown decision, initial Brown decision, and into the early 70s, it was 15 years later, almost 20 years later, and desegregation still was only reluctantly occurring, and then once it occurred on its face, it seemed to have pretty much stopped to where we've now gotten back to it. But what is it about our nation that struggles with this issue that we don't want to see the problems that occur from having segregated housing and then correspondingly schools?
Well, people don't think structurally, the left or the right for the most part, and that hurts because and even right now everything is put in terms of individual prejudice. Not everything, but most things, and that throws you off of looking at what you could really do. I've argued this all my life, but it doesn't. It's hard. It's a hard sell. Also, I think in the case of schools and neighborhoods, where you see exactly what the Republican Party just did for 4 days, use threat. One of them even said that Biden will put minorities next door to you, and suburbs will be the same. And that was all race talk, of course. And they were going on survey data that shows while attitudes have improved, there's still considerable fear among whites of what this would mean. I tried to counter this back in the 70s by saying, well, that a lot of universities, and at that time I was a professor at Harvard, including Harvard and other schools, would actually, if your child has gone to an interracial high school, prep school will give points for that for admission because they want children, whites, who are accustomed to interracial settings.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, up until then, the parents, I remember it was in where was it, Connecticut. I was in, trying to think of the name of the city. And up until then, the parents, and there were like 300 of them, were, to put it mildly, cool to my arguments about desegregation. As soon as I said it would up the chances of their kid getting to a major university, and I wasn't kidding, by the way, quite a few of them were doing that. Suddenly the audience started listening and got enthusiastic.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of showed that their fears could be overcome if they thought there was some good in it. In it for them.
Yes, yeah, that does change their perspective quickly, I guess, right? You know, that they're no longer afraid that their future or their children's future is going to be ruined, and quite the opposite, that they're.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, that they're seeing this opportunity. But when I look back at some of the comments from, you're almost articulating the same thing that I was reading in the meetings about trying to integrate the Syracuse schools, that there would be anonymous letters to the newspapers with the same kind of coded language that, we've invested in our lovely suburban neighborhoods. We don't want our property values to go down, things like that, without saying overtly racist things, but certainly it was rooted in that fear. But you have this unique perspective of not only nationally but globally. Syracuse is not unique in having these problems, are we?
No, I'm afraid not. I wish you were, but you're not. I've worked in South Africa and Australia and the Netherlands and Britain, Germany too. And the situations are, always rather different. The worst racism I've ever seen is in Australia. It makes Syracuse look good. You get these problems everywhere, and it's hard to fight. If you fight it structurally, then you get contact between the groups, and that's when you get change. Change at the individual level. And people start having friends of another group. That now there's an enormous literature, and I've contributed to it. It was my teacher, Gordon Allport, who advanced it first, and then I pushed it after that. And now it's one of the major theories of social psychology. Intergroup contact leads to, under most conditions, not all conditions, obviously, lowered prejudice. One of the things that I am happy to see in the Black Lives Movement, if they're not shot dead, as in Wisconsin the other day, is that how many whites are participating. Some of them are older, but most of them are young. And so I got hopes that this next generation of young whites, partly I hope they'll have had the contact with blacks and other minorities, are going to be different. But I still don't see any evidence that they understand the structural aspects
right.
that they've got to face. But at least on the attitudinal level, we're likely to see some sharp improvements, I hope. Incidentally, not all, but almost all the leading blacks you hear about, from Obama and his wife, who are some others? The guy on is it NBC television news?
Lester Holt.
If you check all these people, there's some more. Let's see. If you check them all, almost all of them had integrated education.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean they necessarily learn their mathematics better, but it does mean that they know how to deal with white people, and white people don't scare them.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been able to succeed. But it also, and I think maybe I argued this back in '69, also they get into networks that whites routinely have that enable them to get better schools and go to better colleges and get better jobs. Because most people learn about jobs not from looking at in the old days, newspaper, I guess computer now. They find out about jobs because they're in the network and people tell them about them.
Right.
And if you're black, you're not in the network. You don't hear about the jobs. You don't know how to apply for this program or this school or whatever. But if you're in the network, you do know these things, and they're critical to advancing in the society. So it's no surprise that these leading blacks you see had, in fact, interracial education that put them into the networks.
In other words, there's evidence right in front of our face, essentially, that integrated school system has advantages that, in some cases, one might call intangible, right?
Yeah, you could, I guess.
Or maybe they're measurable. I don't know.
They're measurable. The sociologists have done a good job showing this. They're not too hard to measure.
Let me ask you this: if you got a call from the mayor of Syracuse or the county executive from our community, and they said, "Listen, Professor Pettigrew, I need some help. I want to start to affect change structurally in this community." What would you offer them as an approach that you think might work? Say they had 5 years to work on it.
Oh boy.
How's that? I mean, that's a blank slate for you.
Yeah. Well, you'd want to try to structurally change, all kinds of things, from employment to education to housing and whatever. But it's hard to do if you've got a white population that's opposing your every move. So you've got to build in some incentives, like I did with the white parents who wanted to go to send their kids to Harvard. It's too bad you have to do that, but I think you do. But if I had to put where most of my marbles would go, would be on housing. And look what the banks are doing. Look what the real estate dealers are doing. I was overcome. I read the Wall Street Journal daily just to see what the other side's saying.
Yep.
And my son teases me because he hears me cursing and carrying on. He said, "You reading the Wall Street Journal again?" But they have the journal actually had a full-page ad. I couldn't believe it, from the housing industry, saying how they believed in Black Lives Matter and how they were fighting segregation and so forth. And they're the major contributors to it, of course. I'm afraid that the movement may be cast out, but people think, "Gee, that's great," they're going to ad. The ad won't do any good, of course, except try to improve their human relations department, but that it would peter out that way. But restrictions on their segregation, you mentioned redlining. Cities can do that. It doesn't require the states or federal government. And I think if you could just make inroads in housing, you'd start to see changes in all the other institutions too.
And
But it's still going.
what does that look like? Changes in housing. I mean, I know you mentioned banks, for example, and if I just search online, Google banks, and I look at the map of Syracuse where there are actual physical branches of banks, I think there's two in the predominantly African American census districts in the city of Syracuse, as opposed to when you drive on the highway to a 90% white suburb, there'll be a dozen right when you get off the exit. You know?
Yeah, you are looking at it hard. I agree. They're the things to watch. And you see housing developments with the sign exclusive. You know, what are they excluding? You know, now they mean upper status, but they also mean white.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the city could restrict that. And you're not going to get change overnight, even with everything you could possibly do, but you begin to get the beginnings.
Mm-hmm.
And as blacks got into the critical networks in Syracuse, you start seeing changes all over the place.
It also seems to me that you talk about how do you sell it to say white families, for example, that if we allow our cities to decay further and the school and the output of the schools to be poor, isn't that a drag on the whole community in every sense of the word? You know?
Oh yeah, and it makes it less desirable for new people to come into Syracuse
Mm-hmm.
who bring skills and money.
Right.
They'll go to the suburbs or go to another city. Yes, of course. And that's happening. I don't know about Syracuse, but happening in a lot of cities. You can see it in Cleveland and
Mm-hmm.
Toledo and some other places I've been recently. Are in real trouble. Well, of course, then the virus comes along.
Well,